How does a tank scratch its back? When tanks were first introduced to the battlefield in the First World War, a pretty glaring problem became apparent. They can't really be used on their own. Much like their spiritual predecessor, the cavalry, it doesn't matter how big or strong your horse, or in this case, tank, is. Any number of determined infantrymen can use really any number of methods to disable a tank if that tank doesn't have infantry support. And this is a problem that the British and the Americans especially faced in the Korean War. See, they were fighting the Chinese, and the Chinese were probably some of the best trained infantry soldiers in the world. See, what they may have lacked in equipment, they more than made up for in experience and tactics. And the Chinese had one specific doctrine that may sound stupid, but was actually pretty effective. See, the irregular terrain of Korea was really nothing like the rolling plains of Europe, and this left tanks very, very vulnerable. The Chinese could really just jump out of anywhere, and any number of them could jump on a tank, rip open the hatches, and just blast the thing open with grenades. And if you were a tank crew in the jungle with limited infantry support, you were absolutely shafted. See, some tanks had gun holes, which small arms could be poked out of to shoot, but these had limited range. And they really weren't that effective, so a technique was introduced called back scratching. Much like the Germans had first figured out when French and British tanks were introduced in the First World War, small arms doesn't really do much. And this was even more true for the tanks of the 1950s. And so, the Allied tankers used this to their advantage. In a tank column, if one tank was ambushed by the Chinese, the others would scratch the backs of the ambushed tank, which means raking it with machine gun fire. The tank ahead would very likely suffer minimal damage, but the people that were jumping all over the tank would be shredded. This didn't really stop the Chinese, however, as it required that tanks always travel together, and with armies like the Soviets who they were planning to fight, this wasn't necessarily so common in their doctrine. The Russians, more than most, were liable to send their tanks out as solo or in small groups. It's also important to note that the Chinese were not the only ones engaging in this. The Iraqi Republican Guard were known for it. And of course, perhaps more famously, the Finnish with the famous Molotov cocktail. However, the tactic of back scratching was not recorded at that time.